The photograph sat in a dusty box for 70 years. Museum worker Rebecca Torres finally pulled it from storage. She found herself staring at something that shouldn't exist. 5 men stood beside what looked like a huge human leg bone. The bone was easily twice the length of a normal one. The handwritten note on the back was simple. It read, "Lovelock Cave, 1931, found with the red-haired ones." The image had been filed away and forgotten. People called it a fake. Others said it was just wrongly identified. But Torres knew the cave. She knew its history. For over 100 years, miners and scientists had whispered about the same impossible find. Local tribes told the same stories. Giants, real giants, hidden in the Nevada desert. The Great Basin Desert covers most of Nevada. It's a huge area of sagebrush and dry lake beds. To most people, it looks empty, hostile. But beneath the cracked earth and inside many caves, signs of human life go back 12,000 years. The Paiute tribes knew this land well. They built their lives around its few water sources. They learned to read its hidden signs of danger. Among the Paiute, certain stories carried more weight than others. These were not tales for children. They were not made-up stories about nature. They were warnings. They were history. They were accounts of a time when their people shared this desert with something else. The Paiute called them the Si-Te-Cah, the red-haired giants. The stories said the Si-Te-Cah stood between 8 and 12 feet tall. They had pale skin. Their hair was the color of rust. They were cannibals. They were warriors. For many years, they attacked Paiute camps. They stole food and took prisoners. The fighting went on for a long time. Finally, the Paiute tribes joined together. They decided to drive the giants from their land. The Si-Te-Cah ran to a cave near what is now the town of Lovelock. The Paiute surrounded the entrance. They demanded the giants come out and surrender. The giants refused. So the tribes piled brush at the cave mouth. They set it on fire. Those who ran from the smoke were killed with arrows. Those who stayed inside died from the smoke. The cave became a tomb. White settlers came to Nevada in the 1800s. To them, these stories were easy to dismiss. They thought they were just myths. Native legends often had impossible events and made-up creatures. But in 1886, something happened that made a few people think twice. A mining engineer named John Reed was looking at land near Lovelock. Local Paiute guides brought him to the cave. They warned him not to go inside. Reed was doubtful but curious. He ignored the warning. He went in anyway. What he found bothered him enough to write a detailed report. He sent it to the State Geological Survey. The cave was huge. It stretched back nearly 200 feet. The floor was covered in a thick layer of bat droppings. The layer had hardened over many years, but mixed in with the droppings, Reed found human remains, skulls, bones, weapons, baskets made with great skill. He wrote in his report that several of the skulls looked unusually large. He measured one at over 12 inches from bottom to top. That was much larger than normal. Reed's report created some interest, but no follow-up. The cave was far away. It was hard to reach. The bat droppings made digging unpleasant. For another 25 years, Lovelock Cave sat empty and untouched. That changed in 1911. 2 miners named James Hart and David Pugh saw money in bat droppings. Farmers used them as fertilizer. The miners began hauling tons of it from the cave. They sold it to local farms. For months they worked in the dark. They shoveled and hauled. As they dug deeper, they began finding things. Items came out of the droppings in good shape. Sandals, duck decoys made from woven reeds, fish hooks, all showed great skill. But Hart and Pugh also found bones, human bones, and some of them were huge. Word of the finds reached Alfred Kroeber. He was a scientist who studied people and culture. He worked at the University of California. In 1912, Kroeber sent one of his students to look at the site. The student's name was Llewellyn Loud. Loud spent several months at the cave. He carefully wrote down everything he found. His report came out in 1929. It listed over 10,000 objects taken from the cave. Loud's report talked about the human remains, but he downplayed anything unusual about their size. He said differences were just normal human variety. He made no mention of giants, but his field notes told a different story. These notes were found years later in university files. In his private notes, Loud wrote about finding a jawbone. It was so large it took both hands to hold it. He drew a picture of a leg bone. It measured 6 inches longer than his own. He noted red hair on several skulls. This was unusual for Native American remains, and he wrote about something else. Marks on many of the bones, deep cuts, scoring that looked like butchering, signs of cannibalism. Loud shared these findings with Kroeber, but he was told to leave them out of the official report. The reasons are not clear. Maybe Kroeber feared other scientists would laugh at him. Maybe he worried about causing fights between white settlers and native tribes, or maybe he just found the evidence too strange to publish without better proof. Whatever the reason, the most shocking finds from Lovelock Cave were quietly put away. The items went to museum storage. The bones were labeled and boxed. For 2 decades, the story of the Si-Te-Cah faded away again. Then came Sarah Winnemucca. Winnemucca was a Paiute activist, writer, and teacher. In 1883, she published a book called Life Among the Paiutes. It was one of the first books written by a Native American woman. In it, she included detailed accounts of tribal history. This included the war against the Si-Te-Cah. Her stories matched what Reed had heard from his guides: giants, red hair, cannibalism, final battle at the cave. Winnemucca said the stories were real history, not legend. She claimed her grandfather had been part of the attack on the cave. She gave specific details about the giants' weapons. She described their diet and appearance. She even said their language was different from Paiute. This suggested they were not just tall Native Americans, they were a separate people entirely. Scientists who studied culture dismissed Winnemucca's account. They called it folklore, but her book spread widely. It caught the attention of treasure hunters and amateur scientists. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, dozens of people visited Lovelock Cave. Many took items and bones without writing anything down. One of these visitors was a doctor named Bruce Russell. In 1931, Russell claimed to have found several skulls from the cave. One of them measured 14 inches from bottom to top. He took photos of the skull next to a normal human skull. The difference was shocking. Russell sent the photos to several museums and universities. He asked them to study the skull. Most places ignored him. One sent back a short letter. It suggested the skull was either fake or belonged to someone with a disease called hydrocephalus. This condition causes fluid buildup in the brain. Russell said the skull showed no signs of disease. He offered to donate it for study. His offer was turned down. The skull's location today is unknown. Russell died in 1967. His personal collection was split up among family members. No museum or university has any record of getting it. But Russell's photographs survived. They raised hard questions. If the skull was real, who did it belong to? How could someone with such extreme size survive to adulthood in a hunting society? And why were similar remains not found elsewhere if this was just a medical condition? Interest in Lovelock Cave grew again in the 1960s. A group of engineers working on a nearby highway project found another cave system. This one was located roughly 40 miles northeast of Lovelock. It contained similar items, baskets, tools, and bones, lots of bones. A team from the Nevada State Museum dug at the site in 1967. They found signs of people living there for at least 4,000 years, but they also found something puzzling. Several of the skeletons measured over 7 feet tall. One measured 7 feet 8 inches. The bones showed no signs of gigantism or other problems. They were simply large in every way. The museum's official report noted the unusual height, but it offered no explanation. The remains were labeled as belonging to a tall group of ancient Native Americans. They were placed in storage alongside thousands of other samples. Around the same time, rumors began spreading among rock climbers and people who explored caves. Several reported finding skeletal remains in remote caves and cracks in cliffs. Some of these remains were described as huge. One group claimed to have photographed a skull with eye sockets large enough to fit a closed fist. Another reported finding a nearly complete skeleton measuring over 9 feet. They found it in a cave so remote it required climbing down a cliff face with ropes to reach. None of these finds were reported to authorities. Most of the finders feared legal trouble for taking items from public land. Others simply didn't want attention. The photographs, if they ever existed, have not shown up publicly. By the 1970s, the story of the Nevada giants had become a favorite of fringe science. Books were published claiming government cover-ups. Documentaries showed grainy photographs and dramatic reenactments. The line between fact and fiction became blurred. Serious researchers avoided the topic completely. The evidence was too broken up, too damaged by amateur digging and poor record-keeping. The whole subject had become linked with fake science and wild theories. But in 1984, something happened that forced people to think again. A team studying ancient life from the University of Nevada was digging at a fossil site near Winnemucca. They discovered something unexpected. Buried beneath a layer of volcanic ash, they found human footprints kept in dried mud. The ash was dated to about 7,000 years ago. The prints were enormous. They measured 17 inches long and 7 inches wide. If you compared them to a normal human foot-to-height ratio, the person would have stood nearly 10 feet tall. The team carefully wrote down everything about the prints. They made plaster copies. They sent their findings for review by other scientists. The paper was rejected by 3 journals. It was finally published in a small regional geology bulletin. Few people read it. Critics said the prints could have been made by normal-sized people walking on soft mud. The mud could have collapsed inward, making bigger marks. The team said the depth and clearness of the prints argued against this idea. The debate went nowhere. The fossil site was covered by a road construction project. This happened before more study could be done. The plaster copies were given to a small county museum. They remain on display there with little explanation. In the 1990s and early 2000s, advances in DNA testing offered a way to solve the mystery. If remains from Lovelock Cave and similar sites could be tested, their genetic link to modern Native American groups could be found. If they were simply tall people from known groups, DNA would prove it. If they were a different population, that would show up too. Several attempts were made to find and test kept remains. Most were not successful. Many samples collected in the early 1900s had been lost or destroyed. Others were held by places that refused to allow testing that would damage the samples. Remains that were tested often gave broken DNA or unclear results. Sometimes the samples were damaged by handling. In 2006, a geneticist named Victoria Harmon managed to get usable DNA from hair samples. These came from skulls found at Lovelock Cave in the 1920s. The samples had been kept in sealed containers at the Smithsonian Institution. Harmon's study revealed something unexpected. The DNA did not match any known Native American genetic group. Instead, it showed markers linked to ancient European populations. Specifically, the samples had genetic similarities to remains found in the Basque region of Spain and southwestern France. Harmon's findings were published in a small genetics journal. They immediately caused argument. Critics said the samples must have been damaged by European DNA during handling. Harmon said she had taken great care to prevent damage. She insisted the DNA was truly ancient. The debate became heated. Some researchers suggested the results showed pre-Columbus European contact with the Americas. This supported fringe theories about people crossing the Atlantic thousands of years ago. Others dismissed the entire study as bad methods and wishful thinking. Harmon tried to get more samples for follow-up testing. She was denied access to most collections. The Smithsonian faced pressure from Native American groups. These groups opposed genetic testing of ancestor remains. The museum stopped further research. Harmon's career stalled. She left university work in 2010. The argument faded away, but it left behind unanswered questions. If the DNA results were accurate, who were these people? How did people with European genetic markers end up buried in a Nevada cave 7,000 years ago? And did their unusual height have any connection to their apparent genetic difference? One theory came from a few bold scientists who studied culture. They suggested the Si-Te-Cah were survivors of a much earlier migration to the Americas. Modern evidence shows humans first reached North America at least 15,000 years ago, maybe much earlier. Most came across the Bering Land Bridge from Asia, but what if other groups arrived by different routes? Some researchers point to something called the Solutrean hypothesis. It proposes that Stone Age Europeans may have reached the Americas by following the edge of Atlantic ice sheets. The hypothesis remains argued about. Most mainstream scientists who study ancient cultures don't support it, but if true, it could explain strange remains showing European genetic markers. Others suggest the giants were simply a tall regional type of native populations. Their apparent difference was the result of genetic drift and being cut off geographically. The red hair could be explained by environmental factors affecting color, or by rare genetic changes that happened on their own. Both explanations struggle to account for the extreme heights reported by early diggers. While genetic populations can certainly produce tall people, steady heights of 8 to 12 feet would need something more than ordinary variety. Gigant the Paiute have their own explanation for why these caves are so hard to find. Tribal elders say the land itself protects the burial sites of the Si-Te-Cah. The desert remembers what happened. It remembers the war, the fire, the screaming, and it doesn't want those old wounds reopened. In 1975, a Paiute elder named Joseph Running Bear spoke to a local newspaper. He was 93 years old. His grandfather had been alive during the time of the giants. Running Bear said his grandfather told him stories about the final days of the Si-Te-Cah, how they had grown desperate, how they had started eating their own dead when food ran out, how they had painted warnings on the cave walls in their own blood. Running Bear said his grandfather had gone into the cave after the fire died down. He described bodies piled near the entrance. Most were charred beyond recognition. But deeper in the cave, where the smoke had been thickest, the bodies were intact. They had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. His grandfather said the largest of them was so tall he could walk under its outstretched arm without ducking. The newspaper reporter asked Running Bear if he believed the stories. The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something the reporter never forgot. "The desert doesn't lie, only people do." Running Bear died 6 months after that interview. He never spoke publicly about the giants again. The mystery deepens when you look at what happened to the scientists who tried to study the Lovelock Cave remains. Llewellyn Loud, the graduate student who excavated the site in 1912, had a promising career ahead of him. After his work at Lovelock, he was supposed to continue studying sites throughout Nevada. But in 1913, he abruptly left the field. He moved to Oregon and became a high school teacher. He never published another archaeological paper. He never spoke about Lovelock Cave again. In letters to a colleague, discovered in 1998, Loud wrote about having recurring nightmares after his time at the cave. He dreamed of being chased through tunnels by something huge, something that breathed like a man but moved like an animal. The dreams got so bad he couldn't sleep. He started drinking. His marriage fell apart. In one letter, dated 1916, he wrote that he wished he had never gone to that cursed place. Loud died in 1946. His family burned most of his personal papers. They said he had requested it before his death. Alfred Kroeber, The scientist who sent Loud to Lovelock had a different fate. His career flourished. He became one of the most respected figures in American anthropology, but he never went back to Nevada. He never followed up on the Lovelock findings. And in his private correspondence, now held at the University of California, there are hints that something about the site troubled him deeply. In a 1920 letter to a colleague, Kroeber wrote about the importance of knowing when to leave certain questions unanswered. He suggested that some knowledge was better left buried. He never explained what he meant. More recently, the strange pattern has continued. In 2018, a team of researchers from multiple universities began a full survey of cave sites in the Great Basin Desert. The project was funded by a private foundation. Their goal was to document and study any remaining evidence before it was lost to looting or development. The team operated quietly to avoid attracting treasure hunters. During the first 2 years, the team looked at over 40 cave sites. Most had standard archaeological materials going back several thousand years, but at 3 sites, they found skeletal remains that raised questions. At one location near Fallon, they discovered a burial chamber containing 12 people. 8 were of normal height, 4 were much larger. The tallest measured 7 feet 3 inches. All showed signs of intentional burial. This suggested they were part of the same community. The remains were dated to about 5,000 years ago. At another site in the Ruby Mountains, the team found a cache of tools and weapons alongside broken skeletal remains. Several of the spear points were enormous. The shafts were so thick that an average person would struggle to hold them. The bones, though incomplete, suggested people well over 7 feet tall. At the third site, something stranger happened. The team was excavating a cave in a remote canyon when they found what looked like a burial chamber. But when they entered, all their equipment began to malfunction. Cameras stopped working. Digital recorders produced only static. Even simple mechanical devices like compasses started spinning wildly. The team leader, an archaeologist named Dr. Patricia Vasquez, described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. 2 team members became violently ill. They had to leave the cave immediately. When they tried to return the next day, they found the entrance had collapsed. A small rock slide had completely sealed the cave. The team's geologist examined the site and found no natural explanation for the collapse. The rock face showed no signs of instability. Vasquez reported the incident to the foundation funding the research. They ordered the team to move to a different location. The collapsed cave was never reopened. The team's findings were meant to be preliminary. They planned to do more digging and genetic analysis, but in 2020, the project was stopped due to legal challenges. Tribal groups objected to the disturbance of ancestor remains. The collected samples were returned to local tribes for reburial. No genetic testing was done. Dr. Vasquez, speaking to a regional newspaper without using her name, expressed frustration. She said she understood the importance of respecting tribal rights and cultural practices, but she also noted that without scientific study, the questions raised by these remains would never be answered. History, she said, was being buried again. Today, Lovelock Cave is fenced off. It's closed to the public. A small historical marker near the entrance mentions its archaeological importance, but it says nothing about giants. The cave itself is falling apart. Bat populations have dropped. Erosion and vandalism have damaged what remains. Most of the items recovered over the decades are scattered across museums and private collections. Some have disappeared completely. The photographs that interested early researchers exist only as faded copies in hard-to-find archives. Original samples that might have provided final evidence are lost. What does exist is testimony. Hundreds of accounts from miners, scientists, local residents, and tribal members describing oversized remains found throughout the Nevada desert. Some of these accounts are surely exaggerated, some may be complete lies. But the sheer number of reports, spanning more than 100 years and coming from different sources, suggests something unusual was found. The question is what? The Paiute maintain their traditions. The stories their grandparents told them match the stories their great-grandparents told. Giants lived here. They were real. They were dangerous. When asked for proof, tribal members point to the caves, to the bones that were found and taken away, to the fact that scientists stopped asking questions when the answers became uncomfortable. There's something else worth considering. The physical evidence that exists. The sandals found at Lovelock Cave were enormous. Several pairs measured over 18 inches long. The Nevada State Museum has 3 pairs in storage. You can request to see them. They're real, they're not fakes, and they're far too large for any normal human foot. The duck decoys found in the cave were made with incredible skill. They were so realistic that when first discovered, miners thought they were looking at mummified ducks. Only after careful examination did they realize these were woven constructs. Whoever made them had hands large enough to weave reeds as thick as a pencil into intricate shapes. The stone tools found at various sites throughout Nevada show similar patterns. Hammers with handles too thick for normal hands to grip comfortably. Spear points that would be unwieldy for anyone under 7 feet tall. Grinding stones with depressions worn so deep they suggest decades of use by someone with enormous strength. These are not disputed artifacts. They exist, they've been measured, they've been dated. What's disputed is what they mean. Some scientists who have studied the evidence privately admit they find the dismissiveness of mainstream science troubling, not because they believe in giants, but because the refusal to seriously investigate unusual findings leaves gaps in our understanding of the past. If unusual remains were found, they deserve careful study, not instant doubt. Others argue that the burden of proof lies with those making unusual claims. Exceptional evidence requires exceptional support. Stories, lost samples, and damaged genetic tests don't meet that standard. Until someone produces a complete skeleton of an 8-foot-tall person with clear origin and undamaged DNA, the giant hypothesis remains guessing. Both positions have merit, but they leave us stuck. The evidence that might have resolved the question has been lost, destroyed, or locked away. New discoveries are unlikely given legal limits on digging burial sites. Public interest has moved on to other mysteries. Yet, the desert keeps its secrets. Thousands of caves remain unexplored in Nevada's backcountry. Every year, hikers and climbers stumble across new rock art, burial sites, and scattered artifacts. The possibility exists that somewhere in those endless stretches of sage and stone, more evidence waits. In 2019, a hiker named Robert Palmer was exploring an unnamed canyon about 90 miles northeast of Reno. He was looking for a good campsite when he noticed something odd, a rock formation that looked almost like a doorway. Curious, he climbed up to investigate. Behind the rocks, he found a narrow passage leading into darkness. Palmer had a flashlight. He decided to take a quick look. The passage opened into a small chamber, and there, sitting against the back wall, was a skeleton. Palmer is not a scientist. He's a software engineer from Sacramento. But even he could tell this skeleton was unusual. It was sitting upright. Its legs were bent, its arms rested on its knees, and it was massive. Palmer estimated the skeleton was at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The skull was intact. It sat tilted forward, as if the person had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Next to the skeleton was a woven basket. Inside the basket were what looked like dried seeds or nuts. Palmer took several photographs with his phone. He marked the location on his GPS. Then he carefully backed out of the chamber. He didn't touch anything. He didn't take anything. He just left. When Palmer got back to civilization, he tried to report his find to the Bureau of Land Management. They told him they couldn't investigate without more specific information. He tried the Nevada State Museum. They said they couldn't act on anonymous reports. He tried local Native American tribal offices. They didn't return his calls. Finally, frustrated, Palmer posted his photographs online. They spread quickly through forums and social media. Within days, hundreds of people were trying to identify the location. Palmer, worried about looters and treasure hunters, took down the posts. He deleted the photographs. He erased the GPS coordinates. In a final post before removing everything, Palmer wrote that he regretted sharing the discovery. He said he felt like he had violated something sacred. He said the skeleton deserved to rest in peace. He said he would never go back. Some people called Palmer a fraud. They said the photographs were fake. Others believed him but criticized his decision to delete the evidence. A few understood his choice. They said some discoveries are better left alone. Palmer has never spoken publicly about the skeleton since then. His social media accounts are now private. Attempts to reach him for this story were unsuccessful. And sometimes, late at night in small desert towns, old-timers will tell stories over drinks. They'll talk about the time they found a skull that didn't look quite right, or the cave their grandfather warned them never to enter, or the archaeologist who stopped by in 1953 asking about giants and then never came back. Most listeners smile politely and order another round, but a few will nod. They've heard similar stories from their own families, and they'll wonder, just for a moment, what really lies buried beneath the Nevada sand. If you've ever encountered something in the desert that didn't make sense, or if you know of caves or sites that might hold clues to this mystery, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories from the edges of the known world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Ism, caused by pituitary tumors or other disorders, does produce extreme height, but affected individuals rarely reach adulthood and almost never reproduce. A population of giants would need a different mechanism entirely. Some biologists have proposed that if such a population existed, it might have represented a separate hominin species, perhaps a remnant group of Denisovans or another archaic human lineage. Denisovans are known to have interbred with modern humans in Asia, and their remains show evidence of large body size. Could a Denisovan population have survived in isolated pockets of the Americas? The theory is speculative at best. No Denisovan remains have been definitively identified outside of Asia, and the limited genetic data from Lovelock Cave, compromised as it is, showed no markers associated with known archaic human populations. The truth is, we don't know. The evidence is too fragmentary, too contaminated by a century of amateur excavations, sensational journalism, and academic dismissal. What remains is a collection of puzzling artifacts, contradictory accounts, and a handful of anomalous measurements that refuse to fit comfortably into established narratives. In 2018, a team of researchers from multiple institutions began a comprehensive survey of cave sites in the Great Basin Desert. Their goal was to document and study any remaining evidence before it was lost to looting, erosion, or development. The project, funded by a private foundation, operated quietly to avoid attracting attention from treasure hunters. During the first 2 years, the team investigated over 40 cave sites. Most yielded standard archaeological materials dating back several thousand years, but at 3 sites, they found skeletal remains that raised questions. At one location near Fallon, they discovered a burial chamber containing 12 individuals. 8 were of normal stature, 4 were significantly larger. The tallest measured 7 feet 3 inches. All showed evidence of intentional burial, suggesting they were part of the same community. The remains were radiocarbon dated to approximately 5,000 years ago. At another site in the Ruby Mountains, the team found a cache of tools and weapons alongside fragmented skeletal remains. Several of the spear points were enormous, with shafts thick enough that an average person would struggle to grip them comfortably. The bones, though incomplete, suggested individuals well over 7 feet tall. The team's findings were preliminary. They planned to conduct additional excavations and genetic analysis. But in 2020, the project was suspended due to legal challenges from tribal groups who objected to the disturbance of ancestral remains. The collected specimens were repatriated to local tribes for reburial. no genetic testing was performed. The lead researcher, speaking anonymously to a regional newspaper, expressed frustration. He acknowledged the importance of respecting tribal sovereignty and cultural practices, but he also noted that without scientific study, the questions raised by these remains would never be answered. History, he said, was being buried again. Today, Lovelock Cave is fenced off and closed to the public. A small historical marker near the entrance mentions its archaeological significance, but says nothing about giants. The cave itself is deteriorating. Bat populations have declined. Erosion and vandalism have damaged what remains. Most of the artifacts recovered over the decades are scattered across museums and private collections. Some have disappeared entirely. The photographs that so intrigued early researchers exist only as faded copies in obscure archives. Original specimens that might have provided conclusive evidence are lost. What does exist is testimony. Hundreds of accounts from miners, archaeologists, local residents, and tribal members describing oversized remains found throughout the Nevada desert. Some of these accounts are surely exaggerated. Some may be outright fabrications, but the sheer volume of reports, spanning more than a century and coming from diverse sources, suggests something unusual was found. The question is what? Were the Si-Te-Cah a separate species? A distinct genetic population? Individuals with growth disorders who somehow clustered in one region? Or were they simply tall Native Americans, their size exaggerated by storytellers and sensationalists until myth overtook reality? The Paiute maintain their traditions. The stories their grandparents told them match the stories their great-grandparents told. Giants lived here. They were real, and they were dangerous. When asked for proof, tribal members point to the caves, to the bones that were found and taken away, to the fact that anthropologists stopped asking questions when the answers became uncomfortable. Some researchers who have studied the evidence privately admit they find the dismissiveness of mainstream archaeology troubling, not because they believe in giants, but because the refusal to seriously investigate anomalous findings leaves gaps in our understanding of the past. If unusual remains were found, they deserve rigorous study, not reflexive skepticism. Others argue that the burden of proof lies with those making extraordinary claims. Exceptional evidence requires exceptional support. Anecdotal reports, lost specimens, and compromised genetic samples don't meet that standard. Until someone produces a complete skeleton of an 8-foot-tall individual with clear provenance and uncontaminated DNA, the giant hypothesis remains speculation. Both positions have merit, but they leave us in a frustrating stalemate. The evidence that might have resolved the question has been lost, destroyed, or locked away. New discoveries are unlikely given legal restrictions on excavating burial sites, and public interest has moved on to other mysteries. Yet the desert keeps its secrets. Thousands of caves remain unexplored in Nevada's backcountry. Every year, hikers and climbers stumble across new petroglyphs, burial sites, and artifact scatters. The possibility exists that somewhere in those endless stretches of sage and stone, more evidence waits. And sometimes, late at night in small desert towns, old-timers will tell stories over drinks. They'll talk about the time they found a skull that didn't look quite right, or the cave their grandfather warned them never to enter, or the archaeologist who stopped by in 1947 asking about giants and then never came back. Most listeners smile politely and order another round, but a few will nod. They've heard similar stories from their own families, and they'll wonder, just for a moment, what really lies buried beneath the Nevada sand. If you've ever encountered something in the desert that didn't make sense, or if you know of caves or sites that might hold clues to this mystery, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories from the edges of the known world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel.